I never thought a simple refrigerator would change my life. #true story #motivation #rebirth. I never thought a refrigerator could change my life. But it did. It shattered everything, and rebuilt me piece by piece. It was one of those July afternoons in Madrid when the sun presses down on the city like a weight. The streets were almost empty, the air trembling with heat. I was walking up to my mother's apartment, holding a receipt and a nervous kind of pride. After months of saving every extra euro from my dull office job, I'd finally bought her a new refrigerator. Something simple, white, reliable. My mother had been using a broken one for weeks, storing her food in a borrowed cooler from the neighbor upstairs. She'd kept saying, "Don't worry, Hija, I'll manage," but I knew she needed it. When the delivery men carried it through those narrow stairs, she stood there beaming, her wrinkled hands trembling with joy. The kitchen filled with that new appliance smell, fresh and promising. She touched the shiny surface like it was something sacred. "You didn't have to, my girl," she said softly. "But thank you. You've made my week." I smiled. For once, I felt proud, useful, like I had done something good. And then the door opened. He walked in, my husband, Roberto. 23 years of marriage walked through that door wearing irritation like a uniform. He glanced at the fridge, frowned, and his voice sliced through the air. "This is what you bought?" "Yes," I answered quietly. "It was on sale, and it works perfectly." He opened the door, examined the shelves, the motor, the label, like a detective looking for guilt. Then came that laugh, dry and sharp. €400 for this piece of junk? You never think, do you, Elena? The kitchen went silent. My mother's smile vanished. My sister froze in the doorway. Even the neighbor, who had stopped by with a Tupperware, looked away. My cheeks burned. The floor seemed to tilt under my feet. He kept going, louder now, listing every mistake I had ever made, each word a stone hitting me square in the chest. He talked about the car, the vacations, the bills. Everything was my fault. Every choice, wrong. I tried to stop him. "Roberto, please, not now." But he wasn't talking to me anymore. He was performing. For everyone. For my mother, my sister, for the kids standing in the doorway. And as he spoke, I could see the disappointment in my mother's eyes, the helplessness in my sister's face. They all wanted to defend me, but no one did. Not at first. His words echoed, "You waste money on your mother while our house falls apart. You care more about her than about your own husband." It felt like the air had been sucked out of the room. My throat tightened. My hands trembled. And yet, something deep inside me shifted. I looked at the fridge again, so still, so silent, and in its reflection I saw a woman I barely recognized. A woman who had learned to stay quiet, to make herself small, to survive. For the first time, I hated that silence. When he finally stormed out, the noise of the door closing sounded like an ending, and a beginning at the same time. I stood there, surrounded by my mother, my sister, the broken pieces of my pride, and a fridge humming softly behind me. That sound, steady, quiet, alive, was the only thing that didn't hurt. That night, I couldn't sleep. I stared at the ceiling, replaying his words, the humiliation, the look on my mother's face. And somewhere between the tears and the exhaustion, a thought appeared. Small. Fragile. But powerful. What if I didn't have to live like this? And just like that, something in me woke up. That night, Madrid was quiet. The kind of quiet that feels heavy, like the city itself is holding its breath. I sat on my mother's terrace, staring at the orange lights blinking in the distance. A glass of wine in my hand, my sister Lucia beside me, and my mother across the small table, her hands folded the way she does when she's holding back worry. The refrigerator hummed inside, steady and constant, like a reminder that something had changed and couldn't be undone. Lucia broke the silence first. "You can't keep letting him talk to you like that," she said. Her voice was soft but steady. "He doesn't love you, Elena. He controls you." I took a slow sip, avoiding her eyes. He was angry. "Work's been rough lately." "He's not always like that." Lucia shook her head. "Yes, he is. You just stopped seeing it." My mother sighed, her eyes tired but kind. "When a man loves you, he protects your dignity. Even when he's angry." The words sank deep. They didn't shout, they echoed. I stared at the city lights, thinking about all the years I had spent defending him, forgiving him, excusing him. How many times had I said, "He's just tired"? How many times had I told myself, "It's not that bad"? But it was. It was that bad. My mother reached over and took my hand. "You deserve peace, Hija. Not fear." The wine burned in my throat as I swallowed. I wanted to answer, but my voice cracked. Lucia leaned closer. "You're strong enough to leave him." I let out a bitter laugh. "I don't even know who I'd be without him." "You'd be you," she said simply. "That's who." I stared at her. At my little sister, who had always been braver than me. She'd built a life on her own terms. She had a small apartment, 2 kids, chaos and joy. And freedom. I envied her. Not for what she had, but for what she didn't have, a man's permission to exist. The night air grew colder. A storm was forming somewhere in the distance. Thunder rolled softly, like a warning. When I went to bed that night, I couldn't close my eyes. My mind was spinning through memories like old film reels, his shouting, his silence, the apologies that never lasted. And beneath it all, a quiet truth rose up like smoke. I didn't love him anymore. Not really. I feared him. I pitied him. But the love was gone, buried under years of resentment and hurt. Around 3 in the morning, I sat up in bed, my heart pounding. I whispered into the dark, I can't live like this. The words felt strange, but right. My hands were shaking. My throat was dry. But I said it again, louder this time. I can't live like this. And then another sentence came out of me, almost without thinking, soft, trembling, but alive. I'm leaving him. It wasn't a plan. It was a promise. The next day, I started small. I made a list. My documents. My savings. My mother's spare room. I went to the bank on my lunch break and opened a new account, my name only. I felt guilty, terrified, and free all at once. Every night after that, I rehearsed the words in the mirror, I want a divorce. Each time I said it, I sounded stronger. More real. For years, I'd been scared of losing everything, our house, our routine, the illusion of stability. But that night, on my mother's terrace, I realized something more terrifying. I'd already lost myself. And once you see that truth, you can't unsee it. That was the night the decision was made, not loud, not dramatic. Quiet, steady, final. I was going to leave him. And though my hands trembled, for the first time in years, my heart didn't. The morning came heavy and still. The sky outside was the color of smoke, the kind that hides the sun but doesn't promise rain. I stood in front of the mirror, brushing my hair with trembling hands, whispering to myself the same words I'd been practicing for days. I want a divorce. Every time I said it, my voice cracked a little less. Downstairs, I could already hear Roberto moving around. The sound of the TV, the clink of a coffee cup, the sharp flick of the remote control. Ordinary sounds that had always made me nervous, as if any wrong noise could light a fuse. I looked at my reflection one last time. I didn't look brave. I looked tired. But sometimes, tired is enough. When I walked into the living room, he was sitting on the couch in his undershirt, watching football, his plate of toast untouched. The fan spun lazily above us, stirring the air but not the tension. Roberto, I said quietly. He didn't look away from the TV. What now? I stood straighter. My heart was thundering, but my voice came out calm. I want a divorce. For a moment, the world froze. The ball on the screen kept rolling, the commentator's voice blurred, but in the room, silence. Then came his laugh. Low. Mocking. You what? I want a divorce, I repeated, this time louder. He turned off the TV. Slowly. Like a man preparing for battle. Is this one of your sister's ideas again? No, I said. It's mine. He stared at me, as if trying to measure how serious I was. You've lost your mind. You think you can live without me? You think you can survive out there alone? I already survive alone, I said. Every day. You just never noticed. His eyes darkened. You're ungrateful, Elena. After everything I've done for you. After everything you've done to me, I interrupted. My voice shook, but I didn't take it back. The air between us grew sharp. I could feel my pulse in my throat, but there was no turning back now. He stood up, towering over me, trying to intimidate me the way he always had. You think you're strong? You're nothing without me. I met his gaze for the first time in years. Then let's find out. For a second, I saw confusion flicker in his eyes. The power he had over me was slipping, and he didn't know what to do without it. He slammed his cup down so hard coffee splashed across the table. You'll regret this. Maybe, I said softly. But at least it'll be my regret. He turned away, muttering curses under his breath, and stormed out the door. The sound of it slamming echoed through the apartment like thunder rolling away after a storm. I stood there, shaking. Not from fear, but from release. For the first time in years, I wasn't scared of his anger. I wasn't scared of what came next. Because I'd finally done it, I had spoken the truth. The fan kept spinning above me. The air was still heavy, but it felt different now. Lighter somehow. Like the first breath after being underwater too long. I sat down on the couch he'd just left, staring at the empty space he'd filled for so long. My hands were trembling, but my heart was strangely calm. I looked around the room, the photos on the walls, the worn furniture, the silence he'd left behind. It didn't feel like a home anymore. But it didn't feel like a prison either. It was something in between, and in between I could rebuild. That evening, when I told my sister what I'd done, she didn't speak right away. She just looked at me with tears in her eyes and whispered, "You did it." And I realized that yes, I had. The hardest part wasn't saying the words. It was believing I deserved the freedom they gave me. That night, I slept alone for the first time in years. The bed felt huge, strange, but peaceful. I listened to the quiet hum of the city through the window and thought, this is what starting over sounds like. The fear didn't disappear overnight. It lingered, like smoke after fire. But under it, something new was growing, something small and fierce. Hope. Days turned into weeks, and silence became my new companion. The house felt different without him, emptier but strangely safer. Every sound carried a new meaning, the kettle's whistle, the creak of the floor, the hum of the refrigerator that started it all. These were no longer background noises, they were proof that life still moved forward, even when I thought mine had stopped. The divorce process began like a slow storm, quiet but relentless. Papers, signatures, and meetings filled my days. I sat across from lawyers with polite smiles and tired eyes, their voices echoing in rooms that smelled of coffee and nerves. They spoke about assets, property, money, things that used to matter to him more than love ever did. I nodded, answered questions, and kept my face still. Inside, I was breaking and rebuilding at the same time. He didn't make it easy. He sent messages that switched from begging to threats within minutes. He called late at night, his voice slurred, asking who had convinced me to ruin our life. Each time, I hung up. Each time, my hand shook a little less. One evening, after weeks of tension, he came by to collect his things. I watched from the doorway as he moved through the house, touching everything like he was trying to mark his territory one last time. The air felt cold, even though it was summer. He stopped in front of a picture on the shelf, our wedding photo. He stared at it, then laughed bitterly. "You'll regret this, Elena. You'll end up alone." I didn't answer. I just watched him take the frame and put it in a box. When the door closed behind him, the silence that followed wasn't heavy anymore. It was clean. Like the end of a song that had played too long. That night, I walked through every room. I touched the walls, opened the windows wide, and let the wind rush in. For the first time, I felt the house breathe again. The air smelled of dust, rain, and freedom. In the mornings, I still woke up early, expecting to hear his footsteps. But instead, I heard birds. The city outside was alive, and so was I. Slowly, I began to reclaim small pieces of myself. I rearranged the furniture. Painted the bedroom pale blue. Bought a new blanket just because it was soft. Little things that didn't seem important, but they were. They were mine. At work, people noticed the difference. I smiled more. I didn't flinch at sudden noises. My boss said, "You look lighter," and I realized she was right. Still, there were nights when loneliness pressed down on me like a weight. I'd sit by the window with a cup of tea and wonder if I had made a mistake. If maybe love, even a broken one, was better than an empty bed. But then I'd remember the sound of his voice, sharp and cruel, and the way I used to shrink inside myself. And I knew the answer. No bed, no silence, no empty room could ever be worse than losing myself again. A month later, I received the final papers. The divorce was official. My name stood alone now, not beside his. I traced the signature with my finger, half in disbelief, half in relief. I called my sister. She cried before I even said a word. "It's done," I told her. "What are you going to do now?" she asked. I looked around at the quiet apartment, at the light filtering through the curtains, at the plants I'd started keeping alive. I smiled. "Live," I said simply. That evening, I went for a walk. The streets of Madrid felt new, as if I had never truly seen them before. People laughed in cafes, children ran between fountains, music drifted from open windows. I wasn't invisible anymore. I was part of it. As the sun dipped below the rooftops, I realized something. Freedom isn't loud. It doesn't announce itself with fireworks or applause. It whispers. It hums softly in the background, like a refrigerator in a quiet kitchen, steady, constant, alive. And in that sound, I finally heard myself again. The first weeks after the divorce felt strange, like waking up in a life I didn't recognize. Every morning, I stared at the ceiling, expecting the sound of his footsteps, the scrape of his chair, the sigh that always came before his complaints. But the silence stayed. At first, it was unbearable. Then it started to feel like peace. I spent days doing things that used to feel forbidden. I ate breakfast in bed. I left dishes in the sink without guilt. I played music too loud and danced in the kitchen barefoot, laughing for no reason. It felt childish, but maybe that's what freedom is, the chance to start over like a child again. Still, there were moments when the loneliness crept in. Nights when the walls felt closer, and the weight of my choices sat heavy on my chest. I'd lie awake and wonder who I was now. If I wasn't his wife, if I wasn't someone something, then who was I? One afternoon, I walked into a therapist's office for the first time in my life. The room smelled like lavender and coffee. There were plants everywhere and a window that let the sunlight spill across the floor. The therapist, Carmen, smiled in a way that made me want to cry. She asked me why I came. I didn't know what to say. The truth was too tangled to fit into a sentence. So I just whispered, I don't know who I am anymore. She nodded, as if she understood completely. Then let's find out, she said. Week after week, I sat on that couch and peeled back layers I'd buried for years. I spoke about the small things, the way I apologized for existing, how I measured my worth in someone else's moods, how I stopped looking in mirrors because I couldn't face the woman I'd become. Carmen didn't interrupt. She listened. Sometimes she smiled, sometimes she stayed silent. But her silence was different from his. It didn't hurt. It healed. Slowly, I started doing things I hadn't done in years. I joined a painting class near my mother's house. The first time I touched the brush, my hands trembled. The canvas stayed blank for a long time. Then I dipped the bristles in color, a deep, burning red, and began to move my hand. The paint spread like blood, like life, like something raw and beautiful being born again. Every stroke was a breath. Every color a confession. I painted faces without names, skies that didn't end, oceans that felt like escape. I wasn't trying to make art. I was trying to find myself in color. Days passed. Weeks blurred. My world was small but mine. I went on walks alone through the park, watched couples laugh, watched old women feed pigeons, and realized solitude wasn't loneliness, it was clarity. One Sunday morning, I sat in a cafe by the window, sipping coffee and reading a book. The sunlight touched my face, and for the first time, I didn't feel invisible. I felt seen, by myself. Sometimes my sister would visit. She'd say, "You look different," and I'd laugh because she was right. I did. I'd stopped carrying the weight of someone else's moods. I'd started breathing for me. But healing isn't a straight line. There were still days when I broke down for no reason, when old memories clawed their way back, whispering doubts in my ear. On those days, I'd paint. Or I'd walk. Or I'd cry until there was nothing left but silence again. And in that silence, I found small truths. Healing wasn't about forgetting the pain, it was about learning to live beside it. One night, I sat on my balcony, the city humming softly below. The air was cool, the stars faint but steady. I thought about the woman I used to be, the one who stayed quiet, who walked on eggshells, who believed she deserved less. And I whispered to her, "You made it." The next morning, I woke up early, opened the windows, and watched the sunrise paint my walls in gold. I smiled, because for the first time in years, I wasn't surviving. I was living. And somewhere deep inside me, I knew this was only the beginning. Underscore 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 underscore. The air smelled different that morning, fresh, clean, a little salty. I was at the train station, suitcase in hand, a ticket to San Sebastian tucked inside my coat pocket. It was the first trip I'd ever taken alone. No one knew where I was going except my sister. I just needed to breathe somewhere else. Somewhere far from the walls that remembered everything. As the train pulled out of Madrid, I watched the city fade behind me. The buildings, the noise, the life I was leaving, all of it shrinking until it looked like a memory. Outside the window, the landscape changed, brown hills turning into green fields, then into flashes of blue ocean that glimmered in the distance. For hours, I just sat there, watching the world move past me. No one was waiting for me. No one was calling. And for the first time, that didn't feel sad. It felt safe. When I arrived, the wind from the sea hit my face like a welcome. San Sebastian was quiet that day, soft waves, seagulls in the distance, the sky wide and endless. I walked along the promenade with my suitcase rolling behind me, my heart light but uncertain. The sea's rhythm matched my breath. Every crash against the rocks felt like the ocean telling me, "You're still here." I found a small apartment overlooking the water. White walls, creaky floors, and a window big enough to frame the sunrise. That first night, I cooked myself dinner, opened a bottle of wine, and sat by the window watching the lights dance on the waves. I wasn't lonely. I was learning to enjoy my own company. The next morning, I walked to the market near the harbor. Fishmongers shouting prices, tourists taking pictures, old women chatting over fresh vegetables. I felt invisible in the best way, no one knew my story, and I didn't owe anyone an explanation. I was choosing my tomatoes when it happened. The bag ripped. Red tomatoes rolled across the floor, bouncing between shoes. I froze, embarrassed, and then a man's voice broke through the noise. "They always try to escape," he said, kneeling beside me. He helped me pick them up, 1, 2, 3, until they were all back in the bag. He smiled, lines around his eyes deep and kind. "Maybe they just want to be free," I said, half joking, half not. He laughed softly. "Maybe we all do." We both stood, a little awkwardly. He was older than me, maybe in his early 50s, wearing a worn jacket that looked comfortable and lived in. "I'm Javier," he said, offering his hand. "Elena," I replied. He nodded toward the bakery across the street. "You look like you could use a coffee after chasing those tomatoes." I hesitated for a second, then smiled. "You're not wrong." We sat by the window of the small cafe, steam rising from our cups. He told me he lived nearby, that he'd lost his wife 3 years ago, and that he came to the market every Saturday out of habit. His voice was calm, gentle, the kind of tone that didn't rush anything. I told him I was visiting for a while, trying to figure out what came next. He didn't ask for details. He didn't need to. Sometimes silence says enough. When I left, he said, "Enjoy the sea, Elena. It has a way of washing out the noise." That night, I walked along the beach barefoot, the water cold against my feet, the wind soft on my skin. I watched the waves break and pull back again, endless and patient. And for the first time in years, I didn't feel like I was running away from something. I felt like I was running toward myself. I didn't know if I'd see him again. Maybe it didn't matter. What mattered was that I'd come this far, that I'd stood on my own, breathed on my own, lived on my own. As I watched the sun set behind the horizon, I whispered to myself, I made it. The sea didn't answer, but it didn't need to. Its rhythm matched mine, quiet and steady, as if to say, yes, you did. Underscore 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 underscore. I saw him again a week later, at the same market. I was reaching for a bunch of flowers when I heard that familiar voice behind me. "Careful," he said. "Those roses have more thorns than they show." I turned and laughed. "You again." "Me again," he said, smiling. He looked relaxed, holding a bag of lemons in one hand, his jacket slightly open to the wind. "Coffee?" he asked, like it was already decided. We ended up back at that same little cafe. It felt familiar now, the smell of fresh bread, the clinking of cups, the faint sound of ocean waves through the open window. We sat facing each other, the light shifting across the table as the clouds moved. He talked about books he loved, the way he used to travel with his wife before she passed, how he never expected to start over in his 50s. There was something disarming about his honesty. He didn't try to impress me. He didn't wear masks. When he asked about me, I hesitated. "I used to be married too," I said. "For a long time. But I left." He didn't ask why. He just nodded. "Good," he said quietly. "Leaving takes more courage than staying." We didn't talk about love. We talked about life, about how people change, how time heals, how silence can be comforting when shared with the right person. I started to notice the little things about him. The way he paused before answering, as if he respected every word. The way he looked out the window mid-conversation, lost in thought. The way his presence made the air feel calm, not heavy. Over the next few weeks, we met often, sometimes by accident, sometimes not. Coffee turned into walks along the beach, long talks about nothing and everything. I found myself looking forward to his messages, short and simple but warm. One evening, we sat on a bench near the water, watching the waves turn silver under the moonlight. I told him I still didn't know what to do with my life. He smiled. "Maybe you don't have to do anything. Maybe you just have to live it." His words lingered. I'd spent so many years trying to fix, plan, control. Maybe life wasn't something to fix. Maybe it was something to feel. When he walked me home that night, he stopped at my door and said, "You remind me of the sea." I raised an eyebrow. "Why?" He looked at me for a moment before saying, "Because you've been through storms, but you still move." I didn't sleep much that night. I kept replaying those words. Not because they sounded romantic, but because they sounded true. Days passed, and our connection grew in the quietest way, through shared coffees, soft laughter, long silences that didn't need to be filled. It wasn't the rush of new love. It was something steadier, deeper. Like a tide that comes in slowly but never leaves. He told me once, "I used to think love was fire. But maybe real love is water. It doesn't burn, it heals." I didn't answer, but my heart did. There was a peace in his presence, one I didn't know I'd been craving. He didn't try to fix my scars, he simply saw them and stayed. And for the first time in a long time, I stopped feeling broken. I started feeling whole. That night, as I stood by my window watching the moon reflect on the waves, I smiled to myself. I wasn't falling in love the way I used to. I was growing into it, slowly, gently, without fear. And maybe that's what love was meant to be all along. It happened on a rainy night. The kind of rain that soaks the city in silence, that blurs lights and hides faces behind fogged windows. I was home, sitting on the couch with a blanket, listening to the sound of the storm when the doorbell rang. At first, I thought it was the wind. It rang again, longer this time. My heart tightened. Few people knew where I lived. I stood up slowly, walked to the door, and looked through the peephole. It was him. Roberto stood there, soaked, hair plastered to his forehead, his coat dripping water onto the floor. For a moment, I froze. My chest filled with something I couldn't name, fear, anger, pity, maybe all at once. I opened the door halfway. The smell of rain and old memories rushed in. "Elena," he said, his voice rough, almost broken. "Can we talk?" I didn't answer. He took a small step forward. "Please. Just 5 minutes." I hesitated, then nodded. He walked in, leaving wet footprints across the floor. The sound of the rain filled the silence between us. He looked around the apartment, at the plants, the paintings, the calm. "You've changed things," he said softly. "I had to," I replied. He sat down without asking. His hands shook slightly. "I've been thinking about everything," he said. "About us. About what I did. I was stupid, Elena. I ruined everything." I stood by the window, arms crossed, watching the rain slide down the glass. "You can't fix the past by saying sorry." He looked at me, desperate. "I can try. I've changed. I swear I have. Please, just give me another chance." His voice cracked on the last word. For a second, the woman I used to be, the one who always forgave, who always believed, stirred inside me. But she was quiet now. She'd learned. "Roberto," I said softly, "you say you've changed. But what you really want is for things to go back to the way they were. And I can't go back there. I don't belong there anymore." He clenched his fists. "So that's it? You throw away 20 years just like that?" "No," I said. "You threw them away when you stopped seeing me." He looked down, then up again, eyes wet but angry. "You think this new life will make you happy? Alone? You'll regret this, Elena." I took a step closer, my voice calm. "Maybe I will. But I'd rather regret being free than regret never trying." He stared at me for a long moment, then stood. "You're not the woman I married," he said bitterly. "You're right," I replied. I finally stopped being her. He opened his mouth to speak, then closed it. The fight in him seemed to fade. He turned toward the door. "Before he left," he said, "I did love you, you know." "I know," I said. "But love without respect dies quietly." He left without another word. The door clicked shut behind him, and for a long moment, I stood there listening to the rain. Then I locked the door, leaned against it, and let out a breath that felt like it had been trapped for years. I walked to the window and looked out. The city lights glimmered through the storm, soft and distant. I wasn't shaking anymore. I wasn't crying. I was calm. That night, I didn't feel pity or anger. I felt closure. The kind that doesn't come with noise or drama, just quiet certainty. I made a cup of tea and sat by the window until the rain stopped. The streets were shining, washed clean. And so was I. When I finally went to bed, I realized something. Freedom doesn't always come the day you walk away. Sometimes it comes the day you no longer look back. And I didn't. Not once. Spring came softly, almost unnoticed. One morning, I woke up to sunlight spilling through the curtains, warmer than it had been in months. The city outside was blooming again, trees dressed in pink, streets alive with people who looked lighter just because the cold was gone. I walked through Retiro Park, the paths lined with cherry blossoms that floated down like snowflakes. It felt like walking through a dream. I stopped by the lake, bought a small coffee, and sat on a bench. The air smelled like new beginnings. That's when I heard his voice. "Beautiful, isn't it?" I turned and saw Javier, smiling, holding 2 cups of coffee. He handed me one without asking. "I was hoping I'd see you here," he said. I laughed softly. "And what if I hadn't come?" He shrugged. "Then I would have waited until I did." We sat together, watching the boats drift on the water. There was no rush, no noise between us, just the sound of birds and the quiet rhythm of people living their lives. He told me about his garden, how he'd started growing tomatoes again. I told him about the painting class I'd joined, how I was learning to mix colors the way feelings blend, messy but beautiful. He listened the way only people who've known loss can listen, completely, without needing to fix anything. When he asked about my ex-husband, I hesitated. "He came by," I said. "But it didn't hurt like I thought it would. It just ended." He nodded, his eyes kind. Sometimes peace sounds like silence. The way he said it made me smile. It was true. My life wasn't perfect, but it was quiet, and that quiet was sacred. We started walking through the park. The petals crunched softly under our shoes. At one point, he stopped, looked at me, and said, "You know, I think we're both survivors of the same storm. Just from different sides of it." I looked at him, curious. "And what happens after the storm?" He smiled gently. "You build again. But this time, you choose the materials yourself." We kept walking, his hand brushing against mine. Neither of us said anything, but something small and certain passed between us. Later, we sat by a street musician playing the guitar. The melody was slow and tender. I closed my eyes for a moment, feeling the music and the warmth of the sun on my face. I felt safe. When I opened my eyes, he was watching me, not the way men look at women, but the way someone looks at peace after years of chaos. He said, "Maybe love isn't something that arrives with fireworks. Maybe it's something that grows quietly, like a seed that refuses to die." I didn't answer. I didn't need to. My heart understood before my mind did. As the afternoon faded, he walked me home. Outside my door, he stopped. "Can I see you again?" he asked. I smiled. "You already have." He laughed, and I could see the blush in his cheeks. "I'll take that as a yes." When he left, I stood by the door for a long time, feeling the echo of that moment. It wasn't a rush. It wasn't passion that burns and fades. It was something steady, patient, real. That night, I couldn't sleep. I sat on my balcony, the city glowing beneath me. I thought about how far I'd come, from fear to freedom, from silence to laughter. And now, maybe, to something like love. But this time, I wasn't falling. I was walking, one steady step at a time. Because love, I was learning, isn't losing yourself in someone else. It's finding someone who helps you stay yourself, and still chooses you every day. And for the first time, that didn't scare me. It felt right. It felt like spring. The move happened slowly, like the tide coming in. Javier started spending more time at my apartment, first coffee in the mornings, then dinner on the balcony, then nights that stretched into dawn. We didn't talk about the future, we just lived inside the present. It was simple, unplanned, and for once, enough. One afternoon, while unpacking groceries, he looked at me and said, "What if we stopped traveling back and forth? What if we made one place ours?" I paused, holding a jar in my hand, pretending to think. The truth was, the idea had already crossed my mind 100 times. Still, I smiled and said, "Are you sure you can live with someone who paints at midnight and burns toast every morning?" He laughed. "Only if you can live with someone who sings off-key in the shower and talks to his plants." So we did it. We found a small apartment by the sea in San Sebastián. The windows faced the ocean, and the light filled every corner like it belonged there. The walls were bare at first, but they didn't stay that way for long. Within weeks, they were covered with my paintings, his books, and pieces of two lives slowly stitching themselves together. The first morning in our new home, we had breakfast on the balcony. The sun was warm, the sea calm, and for a long time we didn't speak. We didn't have to. The quiet between us was no longer emptiness, it was peace. Days became weeks. We cooked together, laughed over burnt dinners, took long walks along the beach. We collected shells and jokes, both small and precious. He built a shelf for my art supplies, I painted a portrait of him reading by the window. The apartment began to smell like coffee and salt, like something alive. Sometimes, I'd catch him watching me from across the room, a soft smile in his eyes. Once, I asked him what he was thinking. He said, "I'm thinking how lucky I am to have met someone who knows how to be alone and still chooses to be with me." That sentence stayed with me. It wasn't about needing each other. It was about wanting each other, and that made all the difference. One evening, after dinner, we walked along the promenade. The sky was painted in shades of gold and violet, the waves whispering at our feet. He stopped suddenly and said, "Elena, maybe we could make this forever. Not in a hurry, not with papers, just with time." I looked at him, the sea breeze playing with his hair. "Forever sounds peaceful when you say it," I said. We didn't make promises. We didn't need them. We had moments, and that was enough. 2 years passed like that, quiet, beautiful, real. We fell into a rhythm that didn't feel like routine. Mornings with coffee, afternoons filled with laughter, evenings watching the sea change color. Sometimes we fought, sometimes we didn't speak for hours, but even those silences felt safe. One day, while shopping at the market, I saw him standing in the same spot where we first met. He was holding a bag of tomatoes again, grinning when he saw me. "Déjà vu," he said. I laughed. "I told you, they just want to be free." He reached out and tucked a strand of hair behind my ear. "So do we. But maybe freedom isn't running. Maybe it's finding someone who lets you stay." Later that evening, as we sat on the balcony, I watched the waves crash against the rocks. The sky was on fire with sunset colors. I thought about the woman I used to be, the one who stayed quiet, who measured her worth by someone else's moods. She felt like a ghost now, someone I'd outgrown. I turned to Javier. Do you ever think about the past? He nodded. Sometimes. But I don't live there. Not anymore. Neither did I. The night grew darker, the air colder, but I felt warm inside. Love wasn't fireworks or chaos. It was this, the steady sound of the ocean, the softness of his hand resting on mine, the quiet understanding that I didn't have to lose myself to keep someone else. And for the first time in my life, I knew. This was home. Not because of where I was, but because of who I'd become. The sun rose slowly over the sea, painting everything in gold. I sat on the balcony with a cup of coffee, the sound of the waves steady and soft below. The air was cool, calm, alive. For the first time, I didn't feel the need to rush anywhere. Life had finally slowed down enough for me to breathe. Javier was still asleep inside, the faint rhythm of his breathing blending with the ocean. I watched him through the open door, the morning light brushing against his face. There was peace in that moment, the kind I had chased my whole life without knowing it. I thought about the woman I used to be. The one who stayed quiet to keep the peace, who smiled through pain, who believed that love meant endurance. She felt distant now, almost like someone I'd read about in a book and forgotten to finish. I wanted to thank her, though. Because she had survived. Without her strength, I wouldn't be here. The sea shimmered brighter as the sun climbed higher. I took a deep breath and whispered, "You did it." It wasn't about starting over with someone new. It was about starting over with myself. I had learned to live without fear, to exist without permission, to love without losing who I was. Later, Javier came out, still half asleep, his hair messy, his smile slow. "You're up early," he said. "I didn't want to miss this," I replied. He sat beside me, wrapping his arm around my shoulders. "It's beautiful," he said. "Yes," I whispered. "It finally is." We stayed there in silence, watching the light dance across the water. The world felt wide again, full of chances, full of mornings that promised nothing but peace. I thought about everything that had led me here, the arguments, the tears, the loneliness, the fear. All of it had been a kind of breaking. But sometimes things have to break before the light can find a way in. I turned to Javier and smiled. "Thank you," I said. "For what?" he asked. "For not saving me," I said. "For letting me save myself." He smiled back, his hand warm over mine. "You were never someone who needed saving, Elena. You just needed to remember it." The wind picked up, carrying the scent of salt and possibility. I looked out at the horizon, endless and bright. Somewhere beyond it was the woman I used to be, waving goodbye. I closed my eyes, feeling the sun on my face, the warmth of a new day beginning. To every woman who thinks it's too late, I whispered, it's not. Because no matter how many times life breaks you, there's always a crack where the light can enter. And sometimes, that's all you need to start again. The waves kept rolling, steady and eternal, as if the sea itself agreed. And for the first time, I wasn't afraid of tomorrow. I was ready for it. And that's how my story began again, not with love, not with loss, but with freedom. If my journey touched your heart, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more stories that remind us, it's never too late to start over. Thank you for watching. Sunrise.